Hi, I'm back again. Welcome to part 3 of lecture 3, the last part. RIT 10,003. This very brief section is going to focus on a couple of concepts, a couple of theories brought up by other writers. The first is Pierre Bourdieu from Language and Symbolic Power. The second one is Lisa Eade and Andrea Lunsford from Audience Addressed, Audience Invoked. Pierre Bourdieu is an anthropologist who wrote a very influential book called Language and Symbolic Power. And in it, he theorizes that language is a linguistic marketplace. That is, like an economic marketplace, it is full of competition and so on and so forth. One of the markers of this marketplace is what he calls, in quotation marks, a legitimate language. That legitimate language, he determines, is instituted by the state and instituted by institutions of power. The example that he uses is the France of several centuries ago, where the central government, the monarchy, and the aristocracy spoke a particular accent of French, and that was determined to be the language of power. If you wanted to be part of the power system at the top of it, you had to speak with that particular accent. An accent was used as a marker to determine who was inside and who was outside. Another example, not from Bourdieu, but from the mid-20th century, would be when the BBC, the UK's national radio station, used to broadcast. And most of its broadcasters spoke what was called BBC English. In other words, free of regional accents. To become part of the inside then, in the UK in the mid-20th century, you would need to speak with this BBC accent. Speaking, again, an accent that came from a particular region or area was a marker that you were not part of the power system, you were not at the top. Similarly, for Canadians, those who speak Canadian French, going to France, you may find that Canadian French is not the same as the French spoken in France, which is referred to as international French. And that, in fact, the differences in the way that Canadians speak French and those who speak international French may work to the detriment of Canadians. Is this fair? No, of course it is not. It is because those in power want the status quo to stand. However, I would point out that when you enter academics, or when you enter a new company, or when you enter any new field, the three concepts that Bourdieu speaks about that go into this legitimate language can be very useful. You don't have to succumb to them, but you can look at the conventions of the field to determine what's appropriate in that field. Those three concepts are, first of all, linguistic capital. That is the ability to use the language of a discipline or a field. The next is social capacity, and that is linguistic competence in specific situations. Now, when we think about this in terms of academics, we might think in terms of genre and of particular audiences. And so if you're writing a lab report in science, the conventions that govern a structure and contents of a lab report are very different from that of an essay that you would write, say, in an English literature course. So you see that looking at the conventions and being able to read them is going to be useful to you. The third one is symbolic capital, and that is the recognition of authority to speak that is received from a group. Now, in Bourdieu's terms, this would be a situation like politics, where the prime minister has been elected by part of the people. As I speak, we've just had an election. The prime minister has a minority government. The Prime Minister is recognized as having the authority to speak on behalf of the Prime Minister's party, and also entering foreign affairs or international affairs, having the authority to speak on behalf of the nation. So these three things put together mean that you can usefully use Bourdieu's theories. Obviously, we see problems with this. That notion of a legitimate language is now constantly questioned, and rightly so. In other words, we realize language really does have power. It not only has power to give people authority, it has the power to disenfranchise people, to place them on the margins, to disempower them. And if we are aware of Bourdieu's theory, we can spot instances of that. So if language is a linguistic marketplace, then in any discipline and any genre, the writer, to be heard, has to demonstrate a knowledge of the writing conventions of that discipline and also of the previous knowledge of the field. But this is like writing a novel. If you sit down to write a novel and you make it so much like every other novel in that particular genre, you're probably not going to get a lot of readers, and you're probably not going to develop your own distinctive style and voice. So one thing to keep in mind is that you strive to know the conventions that govern a genre, that govern a discipline, and yet you try to distinguish yourself from the others in the field. So to become a recognized author in literature, for example, you have to seek Bourdieu's profit of distinction by coming up with a creative idea that is distinctive, or a perspective, a style, or values. The same thing holds true online. You will find that many influencers distinguish themselves from all others out there by their perspective or their style or the values they share with those who follow them. Always keep in mind, though, when you think about the power of language, when you think about what I just told you about Bourdieu's concept, that you do not have to accept what we would call the dominant narrative or the mainstream narrative or the explicit or implicit values of a particular community, whether that's academics, whether it's a company, whether it's an online community. You can work against that dominant narrative, the mainstream narrative, or the values if you consider that they are disempowering, or they are marginalizing, or they are somehow discriminatory. You can create change through language yourself across your lifetime. I would like to now move very briefly to Lisa Eade and Andrea Lunsford's concept of audience addressed and audience invoked. Their piece was written several decades ago, and yet the ideas in it have been used over and over again by other theorists. You will find that some of the language, some of the terminology that they use in their article is outdated and should not be repeated. The main concepts, however, of the invoked audience roles and the addressed audience roles are something that as writers you need to think about. So essentially, whenever we write a piece, we should have an audience in mind. So for example, if you are writing an essay that's going to be graded by a TA or a professor, you probably have that in mind as you're writing. What are the conventions of the field? What are the requirements of the assignment? And what Eade and Lunsford did was, in a time when the notion of audience was, quite frankly, pretty simplistic, was they complicated it. And so when you look at this diagram, and I am peering at it myself, they speak in terms of invoked roles. And so what role might this audience play? I would point out, by the way, that audiences can be complex, so it's entirely possible that the same audience for a particular piece combines several of these roles. So invoked audience can be the self, friend, colleague, critic, mass audience, future audience, past audience, and so on and so forth. And the actual addressed audiences may be future, mass, critic, colleague, friend, and self. So the concrete people we're addressing, the people we think we know, that's complicated enough, but we also add the imagined audience to that. That may be different, it may be the same. It's our conceptions of who that audience is. I will add yet a third theorist in here for audience, that's Mikhail Bakhtin. I don't have a slide for him, but Eden Lunsford always make me think about his concept. He thinks in terms of dialectics, he thinks in terms of response. And so if we look at someone who is writing in a very specific situation, such as a young woman writing to her fiance during the First World War, this particular young woman, Vera Brittain, was in England. She was working as a nurse. Her fiance was in the trenches as a soldier. When she wrote him letters, she was writing to the real concrete fiance, Roland. She knew him, but not that well. She was also writing to her conception of how to write a letter to your fiance, so this romantic role. But there was a third layer here. She was also writing to him with her larger conception of what a soldier in wartime should be, how he should feel. She was anticipating responses then on at least 3 different levels, to the concrete Roland and to a range of other ones. Concrete Roland, fiance, and then this imagined role of the soldier. She was also incorporating a range of her own selves in there. The real Vera Brittain, plus the lover of Roland Blayton, his fiance, and her expectations of herself in that role. And just to top it off, she was also responding to her expectations about the fiance of a soldier in wartime. So what is that role, which is a larger cultural expectation? So the notion of audience, take away with you when you begin to think about it, is complicated. It may encompass a number of roles. Take that thought away with you and think about it. That ends lecture 3 at last. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye for now. This is Andrea signing off.